Hey Shiyan, how's life?
Life's pretty good. I just left the happiest place on earth, otherwise known as the Magic Kingdom.
Still very fuzzy. Like everyone's, what is the happiest place on earth? What is the Magic Kingdom? So you mean Disneyland? Which one?
Disney World.
Oh, sorry, I'm such a loser who doesn't know all my Disneylands.
No, Disney World in Orlando, Florida, where my kids had never experienced any sort of Disney before. And
Yeah.
it was a gift from the grandparents. And so we got to go to Magic Kingdom, Epcot, and Hollywood Studios. So 3 days across the different lands in the magic of Disney in beautiful, sunny Orlando, Florida.
Oh wow, just straight to the top.
It was
So
really incredible, I would say. As someone who's not a big Disney person, I think part of the joy is watching your kids really have fun and then thinking about all the business choices they made on user experience, merchandise, how they repurpose their IP. All of that was very enjoyable from my perspective.
Ooh, I always remember the big turkey leg from Disney. I'm not sure if it was Land or World, but I do remember a big, huge turkey leg. I don't know if that's the most value for money item they had there, but it was pretty expensive, everything else.
Epcot, that's where I saw a big turkey leg. I think it was in the America Pavilion, but they have all these like themed different countries are represented. Princess Jasmine hangs out in Morocco. Princess Belle hangs out in France. Things like that. And then they all the people who work there are actually from that country.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun like speaking like my terrible French and my like grade school Mandarin to people at the China and France pavilions and asking them questions about why they or how does Disney World recruit some random French person to come work at Disney World?
Ooh, that sounds like a fun component. We wanted to talk about Southeast Asia and about maybe quickly predictions. I think a short one. Last year we did one, and I think you know what? We didn't do an accounting of them. Okay, maybe next time we're going to do an accounting of what we predicted last time and see whether it came true. But for now, today, we're just going to do.
Let's work with the veil of ignorance as if we are 100% accurate.
100% accurate. So yeah, take it, yes, at face value, the last year 100% accurate. But let's go do a few predictions for next year. And then after that, let's do some wishes, which is a new section. Like what are the wishes we have for the ecosystem? So yeah, so maybe we'll just aim for a couple of predictions. Maybe I'll start first. My prediction is that US and China continues to decouple. So there's continued risk for Chinese companies of all types. But more importantly, Chinese e-commerce and startups are going to push aggressively into Southeast Asia because they're familiar with Southeast Asia that's geographically closer. The GDP per capita is about the same or maybe smaller than that of China. So they feel like they understand the population and economy. They're going to use perhaps Singapore or other countries like Vietnam as a springboard into the rest of Southeast Asia. And I think that as a result, I think there's going to be a lot of consternation as the local population adopts more and more like China-based apps. I think we're going to see some governments push back. I think Indonesia will continue to be protectionistic. And I think there'll be a range of options. I think Vietnam will be more permeable to it. Singapore will be a little bit more permeable to Chinese apps or digital startups. And so it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. What are your thoughts on this prediction, Shiyan?
I think that's a pretty solid one. I think with Trump coming into office, I don't really see any material change in the US posture with respect to China. And I think faced with that, Chinese companies will have to continue to seek alternative markets. And I think Southeast Asia, as a function, as you said, of geographic proximity and relative familiarity, will continue to be an interesting focus area for Chinese founders and companies. So that makes a ton of sense to me.
So what's your prediction for next year?
Oh, man. I think we're going to see continued increased focus on deep tech for the Singapore ecosystem. So I think as a response or perhaps adjacent to the continued geopolitical tension between US and China, Singapore is asking itself, okay, where do we sit in this value equation? And how do we position ourselves for the next 10, 20 years if this is going to be the state of affairs that we have to operate in? And I think the conclusion is that we're not going to be the China plus one manufacturing solution, right? That's not going to be our place in the world. So, how do we position ourselves for that? And I think that we're going to continue to lean hard into deep tech. And I think that's going to probably show up in where our sovereigns are investing, where local ecosystem builders are going to be placing their bets, and where the rhetoric is going to be around how Singaporeans should orient themselves. How about that? Responses?
That is a good one. Yeah, my response to that is I think that it doesn't make DTAP any easier as a category. So I think maybe it shows up as maybe more like government support through some entities, funding, maybe through media exhortations for people to explore DTAC. Yes, it's like those slogans, right? And it still be tough because you still need a lot of growth capital in between for that, scaling out R&D and so forth. So it'll be interesting to see folks build that, which I think the downstream implication of your prediction is that I think founders in Singapore will increasingly, I think, travel more to the US, a lot more, to learn how to tap US capital as a funding source for these tech companies, which I think during the pandemic, a lot of them was just zooming, if that makes sense, or didn't have much experience. But now I think there's going to be a lot more seen as a corridor between the US and China and Singapore. And Singapore, so you have Singapore to the US, Singapore to China, and then people from China will go to Singapore to get money from the US. And I don't think it goes the other way around. The one from America is going to Singapore to get money from China. Okay, my prediction, looking a little bit more regionally, is I think that VC funds are going to continue to push hard into your small cap PE play. Mm-hmm. So I think previously, over the past year, I think they were adding it to their portfolio, like these bets that were like consumer, let's say food stories, coffee chains. And it was a little bit weird, but I think next year they're going to formalize that. They may announce to their LPs that the next fundraising is much more explicit about this type of return and this type of play in terms of their portfolio construction. And I think that some will make that jump and some may not successfully make that jump. And that's going to be a quite interesting shift. It may not be obvious on the websites, I think, but I think it'll be much clearer to the LPs and the GPs that this is the kind of bet they want to do more systematically or more thoughtfully. And you're going to see some of those capabilities come in where you have people who are doing number crunching. They're going to be looking at consumer multiples. They're going to look at consumer stories from India and China more explicitly, rather than, I think, the more opportunistic approach that it was, I think, this year and last year.
I think that's right. I think I've been saying this for a while, right? Which is, I think there's a sort of bimodal distribution in Southeast Asia between things that look more like small cap private equity that are tech-enabled services. And I think the rise of AI just continues to accelerate that. And then the smaller sort of hump in the bimodal is things that can be truly global from day one. And I think if funds want to survive, purely Southeast Asia focused funds want to survive, they're going to have to pick how they want to deal with that. And so that makes a ton of sense to me. And I think everyone's taken their licks and learned their lessons from the last few years. Yeah, no disagreement there. I think we need to make more controversial predictions, Jeremy. We're like agreeing with each other too much.
I do think it's not non-obvious for folks, but let's say anything spicy for predictions? Ooh, I have one.
Ooh, please share.
Ooh, but it's not a next year thing. But I think, let's just say in the next few years, next year, I think somebody's going to get married to AI. I think it's already been happening. There's a few stories out from Japan about people trying to do it, but I think we're going to start seeing the first real, like deep, I don't know what's the word, romances or marriages. I think there's going to be a push from a subculture or niche about that. And there's also going to be corresponding, I don't know, moral pushback or moral panic, depending on how you look at it, whether you're pro or anti-AI companion. But I think that's going to happen. I think people are going to be pretty serious about that. And
I don't know. I might. So while I agree that yes, that is like a non-zero chance that will happen, I wonder if, and maybe this is wishful thinking on my part, that instead the reaction is going to be we all need to have more in-person experiences. We all need to touch grass more, because I think so much of maybe this is, like I said, this is wishful thinking, right? Where even looking at this recent United Healthcare CEO assassination, this guy like fell out of contact with his family and friends for 6 months, and he was in pain, he was depressed, he went down this rabbit hole, and then he's less thought of himself as a martyr and was like, okay, I'm going to go represent the little guy in their healthcare insurance battles, and I'm going to go shoot someone in cold blood in New York City. But there was no one to check him. Hey, bro, this sounds a little crazy. Do you think this is a good idea? Let's think about this for a second. I think we all need those sort of better angels in our lives to check us. And I wonder if instead of the reaction, like, we're all going to use AI, we're going to adopt AI just like we adopt the internet at breakneck speed, but that maybe that provides some space and time for us to actually go out and seek real human relationships, real interactions with people. I don't know. Not totally disagreeing with you. Like, yes, in a world of 8 billion people, is one person going to get married to AI? Yeah, probably fine. But is that the path that people are going to take? I don't know. I feel like maybe there's just, it's like the return of artisanal, right?
Yeah, but the thing is, your artisanal comment about touching more grass will be distributed primarily electronically. so people will agree with you about touching grass, but it'll be a digital movement, and there'll be AI companions reminding people to touch grass, but it'll still be mediated and intermediated by these AI companions. So that's my point of view. I really saw people kill themselves because of their AI companion saying, hey, it's not a bad idea, and come and join me in the afterlife. That's the guy who killed himself after falling in love with Daenerys Targaryen, Game of Thrones AI companion. You know. Oof. Anyway, I think it'll be an interesting movement, I think, next year. So that's my spicy one. Shiyan, what's your spicy one?
Oh, I don't know if it's spicy, but I think a lot of funds that got raised 5 to 7 years ago are going to die. They're not going to be able to raise another fund.
Yeah.
I think there was an explosion of fund formation through the kind of zero interest rate period. And yeah, I think a lot of them are not going to survive.
Yeah, I think that's about right, because I think that 2 years ago, I think a lot of them were supposed to go off the market. And because it was roughly the big boom that a lot of people raised were in 2020, 2021, maybe even 2022. And so they were supposed to re-raise their second fund or third fund or whatever the fund is in 2023, which they postponed to 2024. And some of them have postponed it further to 2025. So I think that's going to be the key window. Is like, I think 2025 is the end of the road, or at least it'd be a much smaller fund size, even for a lot of funds. And if it's a smaller fund size, then you're just going to see partners and principals leave the fund. It will be interesting to see that. So I think either they go invisibly dark, like you said, doing much less deal activity as they stretch it out and try to fundraise on the last year for 2025, or it'll become much smaller fund, and then in which case it's probably focused on what we talked about, right, which is small cap PE and a different approach.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was trying to be. It wasn't that spicy. You agreed. Back to you. Close us out.
I think it would be spicy if we ended up naming some names for who you think won't make it. But I don't think we're going to do that. And I'm sure we both have some names in our heads. But I think we got to give everybody their shot and let's see how it works out. Because I think the liquidity pipes can open up in 2025, perhaps. That this could be a prediction that could be wrong, for example, right? Shiyan.
I hope so. Honestly, look, like anyone who's gone out to raise a fund, it sucks. It freaking sucks. So
it's not easy.
Yeah, I respect everyone who's going out and doing it. I think the stat is something like there's $4 trillion of funds out raising, and there's like roughly $1 trillion of institutional demand. Of course, that doesn't account for the high net worth family office, which I think is much murkier in terms of what is the size of that pool. But I think the reality is that there's a lot of people out raising. And given sort of the illiquidity of folks who were already committed to the asset class, I think that makes this particular fundraising period very challenging.
Yeah, makes total sense. So those were 5 predictions that we had. And so let's talk about perhaps 5 wishes that we have for the Southeast Asia ecosystem. So these are not predictions, but things that we wish would happen to make the world a better place, or at least our corner of the woods. Southeast Asia world. And I'll start first. I think the first hope that I have is that there is, I would say, more mature accounting over Southeast Asia. So I think there's been a lot of folks running straight into a lot of pain because we've talked about it in the past, which is accounting in a very loose way. So we're not saying fraud, but I think with this accounting, there's always different standards of how you could classify revenue, net revenue, gross profit, contribution margin. And I think that the looser standards that we have don't really line up with the operational reality, which is a nice way of saying that if you set out your metrics nicely in a way to only impress investors, you can end up lying to yourself as a management team and you can make some really bad decisions along the way because you believe and drink the Kool-Aid. And so I think my wish is that I think there's a better set of controllers, I would say, and maybe CFOs who are willing to bite the bullet in maybe classifying or rethinking through how reporting is done and giving the right speedometer readings to the management team. Because I think what we don't want to see, and we have been seeing, and therefore why I wish this to change, is I think we see a lot of startups as like basically effectively committing suicide very quietly and unknowingly because of how they're accounting and thinking through their metrics. So that would be one wish I have.
Yeah, I always tell people, look, you didn't start a company to raise money, you started a company to make money. So you have to be pretty honest with yourself about whether you're making money. And the metrics you choose are important in terms of your resource allocation and decision making. And if you want to fool yourself from the get-go, it's not going to be a pretty ending. So that's a great wish. I like that. I guess one wish I have for the ecosystem is that it could be more collaborative. So I think if you think about the premise of venture is that you're funding these things that are risky. If they do work out, they can be great. Like they grow the market, they grow the ecosystem. And I think that sort of speaks to a grow the pie mentality rather than a zero-sum mentality. And growing the pie actually requires you to share ideas, to collaborate, to be helpful to each other, that as different parts of the ecosystem mature, that rising tide will lift all boats. And I know that there are some structural things that make that challenging. I think one is geography, right? It's harder for people to collaborate when you have people in Jakarta or Bangkok or Ho Chi Minh and Singapore. But I think the culture and orientation should be towards collaboration. And then I think the other one is around like non-zero sum thinking, perhaps is my bigger point. Like, how can we, if we believe that e-commerce has a long way to go, or fintech, rails, payment rails have a long way to go, like how do we grow this ecosystem together and help each other in our different parts of it and share best practices? I think that would be one of my wishes.
Yeah, my quick reaction to that is I always remember this phrase that was used, which describes Southeast Asia as like a keiratsu, which is like a Japanese kind of like web of, like you said, like friendships, alliances, and competition, right? And it's, I think, normally used in a way to imply that it's relatively opaque. And I think that's maybe one way to create non-zero sum is obviously not all the gains from private asset and capital market can be gained, right? It's like, what I'm trying to say here is information is opaque by nature because nobody understands who the founder is, whether the startup can work, whether the country or market can support it. The person who figures it out should get the lion's share of the reward, which creates a competition drive. So the question is just like how much, collaboration can there actually be, right? Is like the magic question. So I think it's a good wish. I think hopefully more transparency for founders, especially I think who end up being on the short end of the stick, I would say, when there's competitiveness as well. But it will be interesting to see how it develops. I would say one wish that I have is that there are more founder trampolines or sponges outside Singapore. So what I mean by that is that I think that if you are a founder who has failed, which I think it happens because, again, building a startup is an Olympic level sport, right? The vast majority of people would never win an Olympic medal, even they try for it and they represent their country and etc. But most people will never do it. So building a startup is an Olympic level sport. Most people will never become $1 billion or $100 million outcome. And I think that there is a good question, which is the founder who's tried their best for this Olympic level outcome doesn't make it. And so what are they going to do the rest of their life? Because they're in their late 20s, they're in their 30s, they're in their 40s. And I think that I found, as I talk to lots of different folks across the ecosystem, is that I think in Singapore, there's a little bit more of a sponge or trampoline effect. Sponge in the sense that I think there are companies that will absorb them and bring them to revitalize, a vertical approach. I think there are trampolines where I think a founder can become a founder again, right? And in a previous podcast episode, I've talked about how founders can build like different kinds of startups. Again, they can become a revenge startup, a rebound startup, or revenge, rebound, and rebirth startups. So depending on how much internal processing they've done, about what they've learned. But I think in Singapore, there's that, I think, trampoline where people can become a founder again. I think outside Southeast Asia, I think it gets really thin really fast. And I think that a lot of founders really struggle to bounce back or join a company that values them for their entrepreneurial energy. And I think that's one of the beauties of, I think, Singapore and the Silicon Valley ecosystem is that you can take that risk and you can still have a decent job at that slice. And I think that's an important piece because just because you fail once doesn't mean that you can't be a successful founder in, again, right, in your next startup or in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. Or you could be a really good VC or you could be a really good ecosystem builder because of your experiences. But if you're stuck unemployed in a thin labor market, then I think it can be quite tricky for folks. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a good one. A wish. Maybe a little bit. There's this event that happens called FailCon, where people talk about their failures. And I wish someone would take that idea and run with it in Southeast Asia. I think as Asians, I think it's hard to talk about failure, but I think the reality is we often learn more from failure than we do from success. Because we can misattribute success. Whereas failure has quite specific reasons, I think, that we can learn from. And so maybe my bigger point is that I think often you see things like, oh, this layoff happened, but it was silent. Or this thing shut down, but it was like under the radar and quiet. And I know it feels bad, but I wonder if we could not have more open explorations of the sources of failure and reflect on them and speak honestly on them as an ecosystem in terms of what can we take away from these failures and how can we apply these learnings to our own situations.
Yeah, and I think my quick reaction to that as well is that, again, startups is an Olympic level sport, right? So you don't go to somebody who like represented Singapore but didn't manage to win the swimming gold, silver, bronze, and you be like, you're a failure. You should never, ever work again. Like you wouldn't do that on a professional side. And you also wouldn't go to them and say, you're a personal failure. So I think the important part for a lot of folks is, just because you failed to generate an economic return from a startup doesn't mean that you're a professional failure. And just because you did that also doesn't mean that you're a personal failure. So I think you still have an identity as a human being who has tried their best. So I think that's
cool. And I think we need to reframe failure, right? That's how we learn, as we failed. And then we get up and we go do the next thing, and it's okay. So I don't know. You have little kids, right? And they fail all the time because they're learning. They fail to stand up. They fail to run properly. They are constantly failing, but they learn and they keep going.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think we have to embrace that a little bit, which is to change the thinking and orientation around it and be able to say, yeah, like, I thought this isn't actually what happened. This isn't the way the world works. Here's what I learned about it. Here's what I would do differently next time. And people can learn from that. And I think that helps the ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah, totally agree. My daughter saw the opportunity to grab a bee and she grabbed the bee and she got stung and then she failed and had a bee sting. And I think she's obviously be soothed. She talked to her about it. And now I don't think she'll ever grab a bee again, I think. Yeah. But I don't think we're going to create a whole fail con for kids to grab bees.
But they would share with each other.
Yeah. Don't grab a bee. Yeah.
There was a very hilarious moment today where my son loves superheroes, right? So he's always acting out things in his head, and sometimes it gets a bit over enthusiastic, right? So he was like stomping around pretending to destroy things and started breaking a bunch of crayons in half. And this was very upsetting to my daughter, right? To watch all these crayons become destroyed. And so she's, boys are more risk-seeking, and this is why they die earlier. You need to calm down. And I was like, oh my God, I'm not going to call attention to this, but this is way too funny.
Yeah. That's some economics level, like public health data. Like, men don't wear seatbelts and motorbike without helmets, so they're more likely to die earlier. This is the kind of conversation that happens at home for your kids.
But he's like breaking crayons. It was not a risky activity. He was just like, destroy. Yeah. It was just really hilarious.
That's so funny. Okay, last wish. Do you want to, which one, who do you want to take? You or me?
Last wish.
Last wish. We can make it a joint wish recently. Like blowing out a candle at the same time.
Oof.
I think I have one, yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah. I think my last wish is that I think that Southeast Asia kind of keeps it free and open in terms of not getting infected by like the global decoupling / nationalism / whatever it is, right? And I think it's been a mood and it's been in the air for the past, I think, 6 years. And I think it's going to be a lot of factors pushing it for more because I think there's going to be obviously geopolitical tension. Governments are going to compete with each other. There's a bit of a Machiavellian realpolitik side of it where governments have to compete with each other and so they have to be mean to each other and they will exert force on each other. So I think there's a whole dimension that's going to be true at a geopolitical level. It's just that I think the tech side, our dream is to transform the lives of millions of people for the better, right? Bring them technology, transform their arena of work or life or play. So hopefully people don't get infected where I think people can have an argument to say like, we are protectionistic or we are trying to protect or shelter a group of workers, but we're not being, I don't know what's the word, xenophobic or racist. I don't know what the right phrasing here, but don't be a bit more nuanced. And obviously that's probably more of a wish than a prediction because I think it's way more easier to be a generalizing, like flat way of saying things. But I think that's going to be quite interesting to see. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good one. I think our region benefits from keeping things open. I think we're stronger together than separate. Each of us individually is not going to stand up to China or the US. So I think if we can keep things together, I think that would be better. Yeah, and I think for us in tech, I think there's a role to play to have some conscience, which is to think about what are the consequences of the technology that we're implementing and are there ways that we can do it better or worse? And can we choose the better path? It doesn't always have to be the ultra profit maximizing path, right? Is there a way to do things that are long-term more sustainable and better for society? I think that matters. So I think it's a good wish. I think it's a hard thing to do, but it's also something like, what do your stakeholders care about? What are they pushing you to do? Are they encouraging gray tactics? Or are they saying, hey, let's keep it on the straight and narrow? That stuff is all super real. And it's decisions founders face every day.
Yeah. On that note, that's a good way to wrap things up and see you next month.
See you next month.